Today we're looking at Chapter 16, which is Waste Generation and Waste Disposal. And I find this particular chapter quite fascinating because no matter what we do with our trash, with whatever we don't want anymore, it has to go somewhere. And no matter what we do with it, it's always going to have an effect on the environment. The opening story, you should pay attention to, just as it's comparing the pros and cons to both using a styrofoam cup and a paper cup. And, there was all this movement years ago to stop using so much styrofoam. Um, for one, because when it would break open, it released CFCs. And then when they stopped producing that, they still realized that styrofoam doesn't really decompose very easily. And so it would make up more or take up more space in a landfill, whereas paper cups were could break down much more easily. But there are also issues with using paper cups. You're using more wood, and you use much more water. It's heavier, so it's more energy to transport it, and so on. So anyway, read that opening story. It is interesting when you compare the two. So when you have a developing country and with very little resources, they don't have much, so they don't have much to throw away. So once a developing country starts to become industrialized and becomes more wealthy, it starts to have a lot more waste. In the US, before or in 1900, the US recycled almost all glass, wood, and metal. And for instance, like the book says, if a wooden bookcase broke, wasn't able to be repaired, the pieces could be used to make a step stool. When the step stool broke, the wood was burned in a wood stove to heat the house. So it was just constantly reused. After World War II, there was the baby boom, so population was growing. Um, Moms were starting to go to work. Not really until like the 60s, but there started to become more disposable products. You had the first TV dinners, you had paper towels, you had paper plates. In the 60s, disposable diapers eventually replaced cloth diapers. Um, and so things were designed to not last very long, so you would have to replace them. And so we had become a throwaway society. And then more products were mixtures of different kinds of materials that you couldn't just easily separate and therefore uh, either remake something new from it or recycle. Municipal solid waste is all the refuse that is collected by municipalities from households, small businesses, and institutions like schools, prisons, hospitals, city buildings. Note that 60% of municipal solid waste comes from residences and 40% comes from commercial facilities. That is a number you need to know. And if you notice from the graph, as what would be sounding logical with population growth, um, and as we continue to be a throwaway society, uh, total amount of waste has been generated per capita and per person. And that's a lot of trash. And if you notice at the very end, starting at about 2008, it actually started to go down a little bit, and we'll talk about that. So if you look at the types of materials that are in our solid waste, notice that a good third is paper products. And then food scraps, yard trimmings like grass and sticks, regular wood like construction wood, and so on. And on the other side, on part B, you have containers and packaging taking up another third as far as what the source is of part A. And so a lot of that container and packaging is could be made of plastic, could be made of styrofoam, or could be made of paper. Durable goods would count as appliances or tires or big items. Um, where am I? Non-durable goods would be paper, some plastics, clothing, and then the rest would be food and yard waste. So let me go back for a second to that graphic showing that by 2008, people were generating about 4.5 pounds of trash per day, or 2 kilos. That's a lot of trash. And even though we didn't do the experiment where you would carry around your trash for a day, if you did that experiment, what you would notice, because I have done it, is that for me, a huge majority was containers or packaging. So, like for my microwave dinner, there's the tray that it came in, the plastic wrap on top, and then the box that it came in. So, there's already a lot of waste. Otherwise, it would have been food scraps like an apple core or banana peel, you know, but most of it was containers. And and so, like I said, once a country becomes more developed, they'll start to generate more trash. So, someone in a developing world could generate maybe only 1 pound of trash per day while we are around 4.5. But globally, what's interesting is that developing countries are actually becoming more responsible of the global municipal solid waste uh, because they're producing more of the goods that we design and invent. And so when they have all this extra waste from the production and manufacturing of items, they have to get rid of it. And generally, in developing countries, their laws aren't as strict. There aren't trash or places to throw away trash aren't really regulated. And so, therefore, they have potentially much greater air and water pollution issues in developing countries. E-waste is another form of waste that apparently is only 2% of the waste stream. And the waste stream is simply um, when a product has been used, it's lost their value and is discarded, it enters this waste stream, which is basically the path of where it's going to go. Is it going to be recycled? Is it going to be put in a landfill? Is it going to be burned? Um, and so e-waste, although it represents a small amount in the waste stream, it's still highly toxic because of all the heavy metals that go into electronics. And unfortunately, which is really silly, those kinds of electronic devices and computers and cell phones and so forth are not really designed to be taken apart very easily and separated into parts. And that takes time, it takes labor, so that takes money. And so often we end up exporting a lot of our e-waste to China and they take it apart. And you can see in this picture here, this girl has no protection whatsoever, no gloves, no glasses. She probably doesn't really know what she's doing aside from just taking apart the parts. But it's toxic metal, it's lead and mercury, so they can very easily get sick. But one thing you don't want to do is throw away your electronics into the trash. You don't want them ending up in a landfill because they can leach chemicals out. So the three R's. In the 1990s, the US started to promote the three R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, and they are listed in the order of most desirable to least. We actually want to recycle as a last step if we can, because it actually takes more energy to produce new products from other stuff. So reduce is the first choice that we want to do, and that makes sense. Is is to simply either prevent waste from becoming waste or to minimize it. And because that means less will enter the waste stream, less will be burned, or less will end up in a landfill, so there's more space. So, and you saw it in the video on Trash Inc., where the man had said, since global massive scale cleaning up of the ocean isn't really possible, what is the next best solution? And he said source reduction. And that's when you want to try to reduce whatever you're using when you're starting the design and the manufacture of products, because then you're starting with less waste to begin with. Um, an example of source reduction for a teacher would be printing on both sides of the paper, or even printing two sheets on one. Like if you've seen me copy the chapters for a few students who don't have a textbook yet, uh, I put two sheets on one side and then double side it. So instead of it being a 20-page packet, it comes down to five. So that's a way of source reducing. Um, a source reduction in manufacturing plants have really done a lot in recent years. And you might have noticed that maybe in water bottles where they're using 33% less plastic. So you're noticing probably that they're a little less sturdier, but just as useful. And just as functional. So they're reducing the amount, excuse me, of plastic. Companies are now trying to reduce the amount of packaging materials. They mention in the book, which is true, that CDs used to come, well, first they used to come in these really long, skinny cardboard boxes. And then inside you'd have the disc. And then they started coming in these long, like plastic, I guess a sleeve, and where most of it, was just useless plastic. There was no point of it. So then finally they started just wrapping CDs in the plastic that they see now. So reduce is the number one thing that you want to do. Reuse is, well, exactly what it sounds like, is reusing a product so that it can stay in, you know, I guess in circulation before it enters the waste stream, so it has longer time. So simply just reusing your coffee cup every day like I do. And um, so we still try to do that, although if you're going to Starbucks every morning or you're going out to eat every day, you're probably not reusing any kind of containers. Sorry. Lastly is recycling, and that's when materials are collected and then they are produced into new products from their raw materials. So there are two ways of doing it, or two categories. There's closed loop recycling and open loop recycling. In closed loop recycling, it's when you recycle a product into the exact same product. So aluminum cans is a great example. The company takes the aluminum cans and then makes them into more aluminum cans. In this example in the picture here, they're showing how carpet fibers and carpets are now being made to be more easily recycled, in that once it's um, been used up, the carpet, and discarded, it can just be remade into carpet. And so they call it closed loop because in theory, it's possible to keep these materials from only being these same materials almost indefinitely, which would make it more closed. In open loop recycling, it's when you have one product, you break it up into its uh, parts, and then you make a totally new product with the raw materials. So, like in this example, they have plastic bottles that are used. Once they're discarded, instead of going to the landfill, they go to the recycling center or a waste recovery plant, and they break up the plastic bottles like you saw in the movie Trash Inc. into that fine, well, not all of the time, but in this case, in this example here, broken up into that flake. And then they can be made into fibers, and then they could be made into a jacket or a t-shirt or another carpet. So, using the same product to make a new, I mean, the same materials, but to make a new product. Recycling isn't new, and actually, San Antonio has been reported to have a really good recycling program. And the goal, I think by its 2020, I think, is to have 61% or 64% of all municipal solid waste recycled. And apparently, right now, we're at about 31%. So we've made half that goal with about 8 years to go. So, and which is typical. I think the average for the US is about one third is recycled, although much more could be. I think sometimes we forget what really can be recycled. I know in my house, I completely fill up my recycling bin almost every week, and I don't fill up my trash bin every week. I recycle almost everything, and which you should be doing as well. Um, We have in the book they mention many communities are adopting a zero sort recycling program, which we do have, meaning that you don't have to have, three different containers like we used to. At least when I lived in Austin, we had three different containers that we had to set out every day. One was for paper, one was for plastic, one was for aluminum. And now you just throw it all together and they'll sort it for you, which really does work out, in our busy society because no one wants to sort. And so if they know that they can put it all in one container, they're more likely to be recycling. Let's see. Well, we already looked at this one, so let's move on. Composting is really cool, and I really actually wish I had a composting yard. I know Miss Fest composts, and that's just all compost is organic material like old food scraps, a little bit of paper or yard waste like yard clippings or grass that is decomposed to produce this rich material, and you can use it um, over gardens and agricultural fields because it's so nutrient rich. But it needs some things. It needs oxygen because it's an aerated process. It needs a little moisture, and it also needs movement. Um, you don't want to put meat or dairy into it because that can draw animals. It also, when meat and dairy start to decompose, it's kind of nasty, and they smell. But you could do it really easily by just digging a hole in your yard in the back, not near any, kind of what do you call those? Electricity generators. You don't want to do it there. So, like in the back of your yard, just kind of dig a hole and start uh, putting in, some vegetables, some fruits that have been discarded, a little bit of layer of, and sorry, the fruit and vegetables would be considered your green material, and then you layer that underneath brown material, which would be like the grass clippings or, leaves that have fallen off. And once you have that mixed, then you turn it. Once you turn it, that starts to add oxygen. And when you have enough moisture, so sometimes you might have to add water if it's quite dry. You add moisture and then you start turning it so it gets oxygen and it starts to decompose. When materials don't have oxygen and so it just sits there like in a landfill, it decomposes anaerobically, which means it doesn't have oxygen, and so it's going to start to produce methane. So that would happen in your composting pile as well if you did not constantly turn the material. But you could have really great compost in a short amount of time, um, like 2 or 3 months, if you did it the right way. This is showing you a composting facility in which it's the same thing, it's just on a larger scale. So you can see here that waste is dumped, materials are separated, okay? What is non compostable is sent to the landfill, and then what is compostable is put in the mixing drum. And so that is aerated, which means it's given oxygen and turned or agitated for a while, and then you have your compost. And letting it to cure just means, kind of sitting there and almost fermenting, almost like a fine wine. And then it can be shipped for use to be sold. So composting is a really great alternative to trash. Most of our municipal solid waste is put into landfills, and in San Antonio, that is true. I'll show you an incinerator in just a minute. So a sanitary landfill is designed to hold um, municipal solid waste with as little contamination of the surrounding environment as possible. Well, you saw in that video that it's probable that all landfills at one time or another will eventually fail, at least a little bit, and some of that trash juice or leachate will leak into the groundwater. And here in San Antonio, when we depend on the aquifer so much, it's really important that our liners are as state of the art as possible. So you want to line the cell. Remember, I told you that they dig these giant holes, and you have to take into account the geography of the land, the type of soil that's there, the topography that would be ideal to have a landfill. So they'll dig a hole or a cell, and then they line it with plastic or clay or both. And clay is a sedimentary rock. And you've seen it before, even like modeling clay, where the grains are so tiny, and when they're packed together, they don't let water get through. So it's impermeable. And that's why they want to use it. Impermeable means water won't go through. So over time, as the trash is being put in there, the leachate or the trash juice is collected in pipes. Okay. Um, Water is limited as far as trying to let it get in there, and in which case, like if it rains, that's why the topography is important, because if it rains, hopefully the rain will run off the sides and not into the landfill. Um, because if in a landfill, you're not turning the material, so it's already decomposing anaerobically, which does lead to the methane production. So the leachate, in our case, at least in the San Antonio one, collects collects into a pool and is allowed to evaporate. Ours also has a methane extraction system in which there's other pipes to collect the methane and is used to generate electricity and heat in the neighborhoods surrounding it, which I thought was really neat. So once you fill a cell, it's covered with topsoil and capped, meaning it's not going to be used anymore, and capped with either trees or gardens or whatever on top. Later on, many years later, closed landfills can be reclaimed, which means it's used again in a different way. And so there is a picture in your book that shows a playground that was built on top of a capped landfill. Tipping fees are the fees that are charged for the trucks that dump or tip their trash. And so typically it's about $35 a ton in the US, although it could be more in other states, which is also can be, sorry, I lost my train of thought, which can be an incentive for people to try and recycle more and to reduce their trash to reduce the payments of the tipping fee. We pay our trash bills in our CPS bill, although if you live in Chavano or Bernie, I can't say. I'm pretty sure you pay your trash to the city of Chavano, who takes care of the waste management. Okay. Oh, NIMBY. Not in my backyard. That has been a case when people say that they don't want trash or waste in their neighborhoods. It also would include nuclear waste, which is a big topic of what they do with spent fuel rods, and nobody wants that in their neighborhood. And so one of the suggestions and what they're doing is like blowing out holes on the sides of mountains and putting the spent um, rods in mountains, which we'll talk about when we get to nuclear energy. Um, so here is a map of our landfill, and we have a few around town, but this is one where I think my trash goes, although there is another one around 1604 and 281, so my trash might go there. I went to the City of San Antonio website and tried to find out where my trash was going and where my recycling was going, and remarkably, I couldn't find that. So I'm going to have to make a call to the city. So I just want to know where it's going and how far it has to travel because that again, that's more fuel cost the further it has to go. And this Covell Gardens landfill is about 40 miles. Well, it's a 40-minute bus ride from Clark. So that's pretty far. So when I had taken a group to this landfill on a field trip, we went and looked. Let's see, we started here and then we went up. I'm not exactly sure where we went. We saw one that was being actively loaded up, and then we got to go see a new future cell that it was being dug out and starting to be lined with the plastic liner and clay. Here is where that leachate I was telling you goes to this giant cement pond, and the water evaporates, and then the sludge that's left over is kind of pumped out and sent elsewhere. So if you don't go to a landfill, or if it doesn't go to a landfill, it can also be incinerated. And, there's pros and cons of incineration versus landfills. In the case of incineration, if you're burning the trash, you're obviously going to reduce the mass and the total amount of volume of waste um, by a great deal. However, of course, there's going to be leftovers anyway. Whenever you burn something, there's ash or there's leftover. So once the waste is dumped in an incinerator, it'll be burned, and what's left on the bottom is called the bottom ash, obviously. And if it's outside or coming out of the chimney or as it's being transported, that would be fly ash. So that's the non-organic material that does not combust. So just like when you burn charcoal in a barbecue pit, you have ash left over. So about a fourth of the volume um, of the trash is ash. If it's not toxic, that ash is disposed in landfills, and if it's toxic, it does go to a specially treated landfill. The problem about incinerators is they are expensive, and so some cities, in order to make it profitable um, and want to be able to fill the incinerator with trash to keep it going, may not um, promote recycling, and so more trash actually ends up getting burned. Um, Incineration also, by the way, does release a lot of heat energy, and so sometimes if there is a building next to it, or it's the incinerator's own building, they'll use that heat to generate electricity or you know heat for the buildings. So that's called a waste to energy system, which is what our Covell Gardens landfill does. They take the waste um, methane gas and use it to promote produce energy. Another problem with incineration is that tipping fees are charged as well to dump it at an incinerator, but it's more than a landfill, and that makes sense because it is a more expensive process to keep going. The other thing is that, of course, when you're burning something and something is combusting, you're going to release some kind of air pollution. And even though they may be trying to use scrubbers to prevent certain gases from being released, you can't get them all. So, incineration versus landfill ends up being a community decision and what's better for them. Hazardous waste is, well, like what it says. It could be biological hazardous waste, like from hospitals. It could be mining waste. It could be chemical plant waste and other industrial waste. Um, and so it could even be the oven cleaner in your house. It could be motor oil. It could be um, lead or oil-based paint. It could be cleaners. Oven cleaner is particularly toxic. So those you are not supposed to put in the trash. You need to dispose of those properly. And if you've ever gotten an oil change, you'll notice that on your bill, they do charge you for a disposal fee because they can't just put it in the trash. They have to have a pickup for hazardous waste. And so there has to be a special place to deposit that stuff. So just keep that in mind when you have um, chemical solvents or oven cleaners or motor oil or paints, that those are not to be thrown away. I was looking to see how many incinerators we had here in San Antonio, and we don't really have much except privately owned companies that will take it off the hands, I would think usually of commercial properties. And this one company that I saw, which was called Darvik or Darvich Services, um, take care of medical waste from hospitals, hazardous waste otherwise. But if you notice the last line there, it says the patented system uses no oxygen. So it has been certified as a non-incineration product process. And so I don't know what they do. They turn up the heat really high and they burn it, but burn it without oxygen. But how can you burn it without oxygen? So it was really funny looking at this website because I could not figure out, well, how are you actually getting rid of this waste? It really wasn't that clear. So that might be something to look into if you're interested. There have been a couple of laws that have been designed about hazardous waste. And the first one was the RCRA, or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And it was basically to protect human health and the natural environment by reducing or eliminating the generation of hazardous waste. So this is where the cradle to grave tracking came from, where you had to, a company had to um, track a product from the manufacturing to the use to how it was disposed. And so that would encourage waste minimization and make sure that it was disposed of properly. CERCLA, or Superfund, is one that had become popular in the 80s. And, well, it was passed in 1980. And what it does is a few things. It puts a tax on the chemical and petroleum industries, which is good because that's how it needs to get some of its revenue. Um, and then what that revenue does is 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 used to clean up abandoned sites where hazardous waste has been found and a responsible party cannot be found or identified, um, or can't be brought to litigation over hazardous waste disposal. It requires that the federal government respond directly to the release of substances that may pose a threat to human health or the environment. And the EPA maintains a National Priorities List, or NPL, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, that lists contaminated sites that are eligible for cleanup. So Love Canal was a very popular or classic example. At one time, it was a hazardous waste landfill for chemical waste by the company Hooker Chemical. And it was sold, I believe, in 1958. I think. You might have to look that up. For $1. But apparently, what I guess the media didn't really say so much back then was that Hooker tried to say, hey, there's chemicals buried here in this landfill. It could potentially be dangerous. But the school board was like, no, this was in Niagara Falls, New York. No, we need to build schools. We need to build housing because, the area is growing. So Hooker Chemical sold them the land for $1. So a few years after the schools were built and the houses were built, people started becoming very sick, and half the kids being born had birth defects. More people were getting cancer, asthma, and it was all being linked to this hazardous waste site that had not been disposed of properly. So it still was Hooker's fault because they didn't dispose of it properly. You know, um, Even though they stipulated in their contract that they could not be sued, the federal government said they could be sued. And so they were. So that's something that we're going to try and watch a couple of video clips on. But it is an interesting story for you to read about. Okay, here's an example of an NPL site in San Antonio. So if you look up or if you Google Superfund sites in San Antonio, this is one that would show up. This is showing you the map. The red stars are on the national priorities list. The blue stars are sites that have been proposed as Superfund sites or those that have already been cleaned up and shut, like the case has been closed. Brownfields are basically like Superfund sites, except Superfund is funded by the government, the federal government, and brownfields are funded by the state or local governments. So these would include abandoned factories or abandoned industrial areas, dry cleaners, gas stations that have been abandoned, landfills. Um, and so these are areas that have been abandoned that probably have some hazardous waste that need to be cleaned up before they could be remediated or redeveloped into something else. On the City of San Antonio website, we do have a Brownsfield program that began only 2 years ago, which surprised me. And so you could go onto this map, and if you thought that you saw an area that needed to be cleaned up that was, say, like an abandoned gas station, you could put that on the map and say, yeah, I would really like to see this as, an apartment complex or um, a business or a restaurant or something like that. So here was an example when I went on the map and I clicked on an area. It's not very big yet, so that's a little bit disturbing to me because there's got to be more brownfields than like five. But there was one here at Worsbrook Parkway in Wetmore. Wetmore is spelled wrong. But they say it's a possible landfill, and they want to see a park there, which is a good example. Seattle did that with, what was it? Oh, it was a coal and oil gasification plant. And so they purchased it and they cleaned it up and then turned it into a park that apparently is very famous in Seattle now. International consequences. Garbage and ash barges travel the oceans looking for a developing country willing to accept it, hazardous or not, in exchange for cash. And the US does this. There was an example where I think they left from Pennsylvania and they traveled the Caribbean with thousands of tons of hazardous ash. And they dumped some in Haiti and they actually dumped some in the ocean. And then in 1996, the U.S. ordered that they had to go and pick up the ash and return it from Haiti to the U.S., um, which I thought was kind of weird. But we do that. We put trash on barges. We did that once with regular trash. I think New York or New Jersey did that. They had a barge full of trash. They went down the Atlantic seaboard, thought they could dump it in Mexico, and Mexico said no. So they went all the way back and just dumped it in their own landfill. So think of all that potential waste spillage into the ocean, but then all the energy that was used just to transport it, and it never even left them. Another example of sending it to us is India will send us mercury that this company in Pennsylvania will purify and resell to companies. So integrated waste management, this is the last slide, is basically like integrated pest management. It's like trying to combine efforts of waste disposal so that you have the least amount of environmental impact and cost. And so that it could include, okay, well, starting with the manufacturing of goods, changing your packaging design, making it less packaging, changing how you actually manufacture so you don't have so much waste at the end, the industrial waste. Then as a consumer, try and compost, reuse your items, try not to buy so much um, stuff that can only be used once. And then when it's time to throw away, compost, recycle, and then finally send it to the incinerator or a landfill. And in the case of San Antonio, it's more than likely going to be a landfill. So the overall goal is just to reduce the amount of municipal solid waste. There is a company in San Antonio that is based out of Austin where they will take care of a lot of your disposal services. I don't know the cost because we don't use them, but they do it all. They compost, they recycle, they have regular trash, and they might incinerate, but I'm not sure about that. But that's a company that does it all. Okay, this one was 40 minutes. I'm sorry I went long, but I like this topic. So if you have questions, let me know. Thanks for listening.